All right, good morning, everybody. This morning we are going to be in the book of First and Second Kings, and as I am looking at myself in this selfie cam for the first time in a long time today, if it looks to you like I'm about to cry, I assure you I'm not sad about anything, but my allergies have been giving me absolute fits today, so I apologize for that if it causes any issues. During this lesson, but let's go ahead and jump into First and Second Kings. There's some important things to remember about this book, just to kind of give you a little bit of background. This picks up where Second Samuel leaves off, and First and Second Samuel give us a whole lot of detail about, of course, the prophet Samuel and his origins, and then the first two kings of Israel, King Saul and King David. It gives us the just about the entirety of the story of King David and his reign. And where First Kings picks up is at the tail end of David's reign, when David is on his deathbed, and chapter 1 is all about how the succession happens. But we'll get into that in just a second. First and Second Kings was compiled during the time of the exile. We don't know who wrote it, but we do know that whoever it was had access to a lot of historical documents. It's actually quite possible that First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, that compilation process may have started during the reign of King Josiah, which was shortly before the exile. We're actually going to find out a little bit about that today. But it was, put in its final form during the time of the exile. And part of the intention, of course, the major intention is to show the history of the monarchy, especially of both Saul and of the line of David, the history of Israel's monarchy from start to finish, because at the end of Second Kings, there's no more kings. To show the history of that, but also to demonstrate, hey, we are in exile right now because of our sin. Because of the sins of our kings. The events take place roughly somewhere between 970 BC and 560 BC. So about 400 years going on there. Some major world powers rise up. In fact, it's important to note that Israel geographically was and still is an incredibly strategic location. The world powers that were rising up at that time were the Assyrians and the Persians, also known as Babylon. And those are the areas sort of just northeast and northwest of Israel. And one of the natural places that they're going to want to try and get to is Egypt. And you've got to go through Israel to get to Egypt. It's the last stop before you get to the desert, which was, of course, the wilderness that the Israelites wandered in. And so this is an incredibly strategic location. If you are a world power, you want to control this location. And so if any nation was ever going to need God's protection, it was going to be Israel. That's how important their geography was. So let's get into this a little bit. That's sort of the historical context, its context in Scripture. But let's think for just a moment about its context within salvation history, its redemptive historical context. So the covenant with David looms large in the background here. Once Israel splits up into two different countries, they have, they part their own ways. You've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. All of the kings of the southern kingdom are compared to David. And part of the reason that comparison happens is because the people compiling this want there to just be this big time reminder that God has made a promise to David that his line will continue, that there's going to be consequences if the kings in his line are wicked, but that his line is going to continue. So that there's that constant comparison to David. And then But remember, God's covenant is not just with David. God's covenant predates David. So the promise is not just that there would that David's line would continue. The promise is also revolves around this land that they inhabit, and that Abraham's line would continue. And once we get to the very end of of Second Kings, the very end of Second Kings, all of this appears to be in jeopardy. So we'll wait to talk about that some more whenever we get to the very end. So what is the theme of First and Second Kings? Well, the theme of First and Second Kings, it's right there in your handout. It says the king, the covenant representative. Sometimes the king obeys the word of Yahweh and the people are blessed, but sometimes the king rebels against the word of Yahweh and brings calamity upon the people. Finally, Yahweh's patience runs out, and his people suffer the covenant consequences for their sins. Yet through it all, Yahweh is still faithful to the promises that he made to David. Now, in the first two chapters of 2 Kings, I remember I told you that this is the tail end of David's reign. He is on his deathbed, and there are some things that he has to do, that he has to put in place to make sure that the right person succeeds him in the throne. In fact, there's some real like Game of Thrones type stuff going on in the first chapters, the first two chapters of First and Second Kings. And if you have not watched Game of Thrones, I am not recommending it to you. I want to make that very clear, right? But there's some common things going on just in terms of palace intrigue and double crosses and all kinds of like complicated plots against different groups of people. So basically, David's son Adonijah, I believe, is the son that does this, right? Yeah, David's son Adonijah decides he wants to be king. And so he courts the favor of some important people in David's orbit, including David's most important general, right? He gets David's most important general to take his side and to support his claim to the throne. And so he's got all of these important military people supporting him. But there's just one problem. That's not who God wants to be king. It's not who David wants to be king. And it is not who David's prophets, his religious leaders there in the kingdom, want to be king. God, David, the religious leaders, they all want Solomon to be the next king. And this is not, like other kingdoms where it's just assumed that the oldest son is going to be king. It's going to be whoever the king wants. Whoever the active king wants to be the next king, that's who's going to be the next king. And so there's all kinds of intrigue, all kinds of plotting going on to ensure that Solomon is the next king. In fact, after Solomon becomes king, David essentially creates this hit list of, hey, these are the people you got to take out in order to assure that your kingdom stands. So a lot of interesting stuff going on there. Now, when there's something that's really interesting that happens, and this is very important. Actually, for church today, in the worship service this morning, you're going to be learning about the Jesus's triumphal entry, where sort of the last act of his life and ministry is when he begins when he rides into Jerusalem on that donkey, and the people are shouting praises, shouting Hosanna, laying palm branches at his feet. Y'all will be learning about the triumphal entry today in the worship service. But what's really interesting is that if you go back to 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 33 through 35, what you will see is that when Solomon, and David gives him these very specific instructions. He says, this is what I want you to do. When Solomon is riding into town to claim his kingdom, his rightful kingdom, away from the usurper Adonijah, David tells him, I want you to ride into town on my donkey, right? And that way everyone will know that you are the one who is succeeding as king. I want you to ride into town on my donkey. Now, here's the first question I want to ask you, and I'm going to give you some time to talk about it. I'm going to let Dan come up here and pause the video after I ask the question. here's the question is this. So, how does it impact your view of the triumphal entry? How does it impact your view, your understanding of that time when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, knowing now that the reason he does that is to draw a very direct connection between himself and Solomon, who was, of course, the original son of David? How does that impact your understanding of Jesus's triumphal entry? I'll give you all a few minutes to talk about that. Dan, if you want to come pause the video. Okay, so y'all should have had a few minutes to talk about that. I will say that the way that it impacts my understanding is that typically we make a big deal about the humility of this gesture. Jesus is not riding in on a war horse; he is riding in on a donkey, and that is exactly the way the Romans would have understood it. They would have been like, who is this, guy riding in on a donkey? What does he think he's doing? And so, yes. Humility is one of the things that we're supposed to understand from Jesus' action. But it is not just humility. It is also Jesus making a very direct and straightforward kingship claim. And students of the scriptures would have known that this is not just a humble act. This is also Jesus is putting himself out there. He's saying, I'm riding into town just like Solomon rode into town, claiming my throne away from this pretender, this usurper, Herod, who is not a real son of David. Okay, so that is that. But then, so after that happens, David commissions Solomon. He gives Solomon some very specific instructions. This is one of the last things he tells him before he dies, and he says, in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, David says, when David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. In other words, I'm about to die. So be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Now, if you've read Kings, you know that is not exactly the way it works out. For a good long time, Solomon is faithful. But then after Solomon, there's mostly unfaithful kings and a few faithful ones. And so it gets a little bit tenuous. As a reader, you get a little bit worried. Is David's line going to last? Well, it's going to last because God promises it's going to last. But there's also going to be some bumps in the road. And it's going to get dire because neither Israel nor David's descendants keep up their end of the bargain. So the reign of King Solomon is sort of seen as, he's not necessarily seen as the greatest king in Israel's history, but his reign is sort of seen as the zenith, the very tip top, the very pinnacle of the monarchy era during the time of Israel. And not only that, but the very highest point, not only in Solomon's reign, but in the entire history of that monarchy, comes in 1 Kings chapter 8, towards the end, after the temple is built and God's presence inhabits the temple. This is a big promise fulfilled. The temple is an incredibly important place in the life of the nation from that point forward. And so, like, Solomon's reign is the absolute high point, and the high point of Solomon's reign is when God comes and inhabits the temple. He is known as the wisest king. That is the time during which Israel was its largest, its most powerful, its wealthiest, its most advanced civilization, its highest place among all of the other nations of the world. I mean, that's the pinnacle. But it does not last for long. Because what we learned towards the end of Solomon's reign in 1 Kings chapter 11 is that Solomon made all of the same mistakes that David made, and then some. Because David, for the depth of sin that he committed, his heart never strayed toward other false gods. Solomon's did. Solomon was led astray by some of his wives, some of his concubines, and he began to worship other gods later in life. And because of that, God told him, hey, this is not lasting for your descendants. The kingdoms will now be divided. Your descendants will no longer rule over all of Israel. But for David, not for you, for David, his descendants and your descendants will have somebody on the throne of the southern kingdom. You will still get to reign over one tribe, the tribe of Judah, David's tribe, in the southern kingdom, the land of Judah. You still get Jerusalem. But from that point forward, there is a split in the two kingdoms. There is a split in the two kingdoms. Now, time for question number two. Question number two. So Solomon is only the third king in the history of the monarchy. He's only the third king. And yet the experiment of allowing Israel to have a king already seems to be falling apart. Now, we know that God isn't surprised by any of this. So if God already knew what was going to happen, why does he allow them to embark on this experiment in the first place? In other words, this experiment of giving Israel a monarchy. If God already knew that it was going to fall apart, why does he allow them to do this in the first place? What do you think? I'll give you all a minute to talk about that. All right, if y'all have not finished talking about it, Dan, you can go ahead and press pause. But I'm assuming that if I'm talking, it's because you pressed unpause. I'm sure y'all had great discussion. I don't know that this is the one answer. There's probably a number of correct answers to that question of why did God allow this in the first place. But I do know that in Romans chapter 9, as Paul is sort of explaining Israel's history as God's chosen people, part of his explanation is that God knew that Israel would fail. And so he wanted their failure to be an example for the world about why grace is needed, why grace is necessary, about how people can't be righteous on their own. And Israel was the example for the world for that. So that is one answer. If you did not come to that answer, that does not mean you're wrong. So now we've got Judah, which is the southern kingdom, and we've got Israel, which is the northern kingdom. Now, the rift between these two kingdoms, it doesn't just happen because God declares it's going to happen. This is actually something that had been in the works for a while. It's kind of something that the northern kingdom had already wanted for a while. In fact, towards the end of 2 Samuel, there's this episode when David is coming back to Jerusalem after having been gone for a while because another one of his sons had tried to usurp the throne. On his way back to Jerusalem, there's these people from the northern kingdom who are mocking him, and you get the sense that a lot of folks in the northern kingdom were still hung up on Saul. They loved Saul. They resented David for what they thought as what was him sort of taking the kingdom away from Saul. Saul was their guy. They loved Saul. And so people in the northern kingdom, there was already some tension going on there. Saul was the people who originally brought the two kingdoms together. They stayed together through the reign of David, but then by the end of Solomon's reign, it's done. And so this brings us to our third question. We've hit the major, King Saul, King David, King Solomon. Like these are the major kings in the history of Israel. There's some other big things that happen in the book of Kings, but I want you to pause the video for just a moment and just consider this. Is there anything so far in this study of 1st and 2nd Kings that maybe you had forgotten that it had happened, or something that has surprised you so far about this study? Just take a few minutes and talk about that. Okay, well, let's go ahead and spend a few minutes talking about the Northern Kingdom. Okay, so one of the interesting things about the Northern Kingdom is that every single king of the Northern Kingdom that gets written about in Kings, in the book of Kings, it is basically said they did evil in the sight of the Lord. There were no righteous kings in the Northern Kingdom ever. In fact, the very first king, one of the things that he does during his reign is he builds golden calves. I mean, are you serious? Actual golden calves, which is one of the things that the Israelites did that made God angry all the way back in Exodus. He repeats that same mistakes and builds golden calves for the people as Jeroboam. And so we don't get just a ton of detail. We learn who each of the kings are. We know the succession, but we don't get a whole lot of details about the kings themselves. Actually, the people who we get a lot of detail about in the Northern Kingdom are the prophets, especially Elijah and Elisha. The book of 1st Kings is where we read about Elijah and Elisha. They've got some amazing stories about them. They are really the important characters in the Northern Kingdom. Elijah, his major showdowns are against King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. So if you've ever heard that name Jezebel, that's where she comes from. She is a wife of one of the northern kings of Israel and a major antagonist against Elijah. And that is in 1 Kings chapter 17 all the way through 2 Kings chapter 13. That's where you can sort of read about the adventures of Elijah and Elisha. So they take up a big part of that. And then finally, in 2 Kings chapter 17, this is where the northern kingdom comes to an end. The Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom, but not the southern kingdom. They attack the southern kingdom, but do not fully conquer them. They conquer the northern kingdom and carry everybody away into exile, and there is never a northern kingdom again. Eventually, some people, we know from history, we don't know this from the book of Kings, we know from history that eventually some people from the northern kingdom do make it back to that territory. They become the people known as the Samaritans. But there is never a northern kingdom in Israel again. It is gone. It's gone. And then, like I said, the Assyrians attack the southern kingdom, but they never fully conquer the southern kingdom. So in the southern kingdom, in Judah, there are some good kings, mostly bad kings, but it's a little bit different history for them. The very first king in the southern kingdom is named Abijam. Okay, and so as I'm going to read this passage to you from 1 King chapter 15, and notice how it's a little bit different than what happens in the northern kingdom. He says, Abijam, he walked in all of the same sins that his father did before him, that's David, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Nevertheless, For David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem. So every king in Judah gets compared to David. The kings of the northern kingdom don't. Every king in Judah gets compared to David. And notice, it's not that Abijam was necessarily more wicked in general than David was. He committed all of the same sins David did, and added to that the sin of his heart straying from God. So we don't know if he worshiped other gods or if he just wasn't interested in God in general, but add that to all of the other sins that David committed. But for David's sake, he says that he's going to continue the line of David. So David is sort of like the benchmark for righteousness because his heart never strayed from God. Then we get to 2 Kings chapter 18. There's a number of kings along the way. But in 2 Kings chapter 18, there is a king named Hezekiah. And it is during Hezekiah's reign that Judah is attacked by Syria. And like I said, Assyria doesn't win, but it does get into a situation where Judah has to pay a pretty expensive tribute to the Assyrians in order to remain sovereign. But the reason that Assyria does not fully conquer Judah, Kings attributes that to the fact that Hezekiah is a righteous king. He is a righteous king. He is a king after David's own heart. And he is considered one of the good kings. And then shortly after Hezekiah, however, you have Manasseh. Manasseh is considered the most wicked king in the history of Israel. It says that he shed tons and tons of innocent blood. The assumption is there that the way he shed that blood was through human sacrifice. He sacrificed one of his own sons to the god Moloch. God did not appreciate that. And because of the depth of Manasseh's wickedness, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. And God says, okay, southern kingdom, now you are done. The northern kingdom's done. Southern kingdom, now you are done. It's not going to be right away, but there is no turning back. My judgment is coming upon you. It's over for y'all. It is over. Now, here's the thing, though. Shortly after Manasseh, you get Josiah. Now, Josiah is considered to be the most righteous king in the history of Israel. Let me say that again. The most righteous king in the history of Israel, meaning he is even more righteous than David. King Josiah's story begins in chapter 22 of 2 Kings. He's the person who rediscovers the books of the law. The previous kings had just sort of let those fall by the wayside. Nobody ever taught those to him, but he found them. He rediscovered them, brought them forward to all the people. He leads reforms that are designed to return the people to the worship of the one true God. Many people at that time believed that Josiah was the promised Messiah. And we know now on the other side of his reign that he wasn't, but that's how righteous he was. The people believed he was the promised Messiah. But here's the thing. Even though Josiah was even though Josiah was the most righteous king, God's judgment had already been decided. It's happening. And God ultimately does not relent, even though Josiah is that righteous. And in fact, Josiah later in life, he dies in battle at the hand of the Egyptians, and it's just kind of the idea there is that the reason Josiah dies, it has more to do with Manasseh's sins than anything he had done. And so that brings us to our next question, second to the last question for today, and that is this. And Dan will come up and pause the video while you discuss this. And it's, does it seem fair that God is going to continue in his plan to judge Judah in spite of the fact that Josiah is the most righteous king in history of either kingdoms? Why do you think God does not relent? And I'll give y'all a few minutes to discuss that. Okay. All right. So, the way I think about that question, is it fair? And once again, if none of y'all got this answer, doesn't mean y'all are wrong. There's, like I said, a number of possible correct answers. Um, but whenever I think about this question, is it fair that God does not relent in his judgment, even though Josiah was an incredibly righteous king? I'm not sure. Ultimately, I think it is fair, although I don't know if fairness is the right sort of way to frame it. I do know this. We've already established God has not been surprised by any of this. He has not been surprised by the wickedness of any of these kings. He knows what is going to happen. God has a plan. And we now know that God's plan is about, his ultimate plan for salvation is by grace through faith, not salvation by the military might of a powerful king, no matter how righteous they are, right? And so it kind of, it stinks for Josiah that this is going to happen, but it is ultimately part of God's good and perfect plan that, remember, he didn't really want kings in the first place. Like God's whole thing was that God wanted to be king of the people. And so his plan is to get the people back to that point where he is their king. And that is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Now, after Josiah, there are only two more kings in Judah, Jehoaz and Jehoiakim. They both, believe it or not, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And it was under Jehoiakim that Babylon eventually utterly destroyed the temple, utterly destroyed Jerusalem, and carried all of the people, including him, carried Jehoiakim away in captivity. Now, they won the battle. There was massive destruction in Jerusalem. But before they utterly destroyed Jerusalem, Babylon set up a puppet king. They took a relative of Jehoiakim, his uncle, and they set him up as a puppet king. But then this puppet king, Jehoiakim's uncle, tried to lead a kind of semi-rebellion against Babylon. And what they did was they took Jehoiakim's uncle, I don't remember his name, his uncle, this puppet king. They took him, and then they gathered all of the remaining descendants of David or relatives of David or anybody who had any claim to the throne, brought them all into a room and killed all of them one by one. And then the very last thing that they did was cut out the eyes of this puppet king. So the very last thing he saw was what he thought was David's line being exterminated, ended. This is just, like a massive blow. The worst thing you could possibly imagine happening. And then after that, that's when Jerusalem is totally destroyed, completely wiped out. And so here's what we are left thinking. We are left thinking that God's promise is over, that it's done. There is no more Jerusalem. There is no more temple. There are no more descendants of David. Or are there? Remember, Jehoiakim had been taken into captivity and had kind of been forgotten about by the Babylonians. And this is where you get just one last little ray of sunshine at the end of 2 Kings. We learn that Jehoiakim, after spending some years in prison, is finally released from prison. He's not allowed to go back to Israel, but he is released from prison and allowed to live out his days in comfort there in Babylon. And that's sort of where things end. And so at the very end, we have this last little ray of hope. All is not lost a member of the line of David, still lives, and so there is still a possibility for a future of God's promise. That is where 2 Kings ends. Now, this is the last question. I'm gonna, we don't even have to pause it after this question. We can just turn it off, and y'all can talk about anything that we just talked about in the book of 2 Kings. But before you do that, I want you to address this question. So if you remember all the way back to the beginning of this study, back in April, I think it was. Might have been, yeah, I think it was back in April. We said that the rest of the Old Testament in its entirety is sort of a mirror image of Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And so this is what I want to ask you. What event or events, because there's two possible events that could be the answer to this, what event or events in Genesis 1 through 11 do these stories of the exiles of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, what do they remind you of from what do you think they are meant to be mirror images of from those first 11 chapters of Genesis? So I'll let y'all talk about that. Then you can talk about whatever you want to talk about from 1st and 2nd Kings, and we'll let one of y'all close in prayer. And I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have a great time in worship today. See y'all next week.